Hey, John, how are you doing today?
Hey Paula, I'm doing well. It's great to see you again, virtually, of course.
I know. Hopefully that's going to change soon. But even still, right, we can produce some valuable content for our friends out there. I'm so excited. We are kicking off a series of articles, right? We've taken on another ambitious little side hustle because that's just kind of the people we are. We don't have enough to do in our day jobs, right? So before we get started, everybody kind of knows that I'm a CFO and RPA kind of gal. I make that pretty clear. But you are a data doctor. And this is a different spin on my typical interviews. So I wanted you to go ahead and introduce yourself just a little bit. Tell a little bit about our background and our history together so we can kind of prime our audience for what we're digging into today.
Yes, absolutely. John Perry, I'm the Director of Data Analytics and Strategy at Syracuse University, focused really on their annual giving program. My background, Paula, as you know, it really stems from process improvement and supply chain. You and I had a wonderful year-long project of divesting I believe at the time it was a $1 billion entity for what is now a Fortune 500 company. It was great meeting you then and working with you and collaborating with you over the last 5+ years now or so. I think that's about
Something
right.
like
And
that. Yeah, something like that.
yeah, so my entire background has really been focused on the world of data in a bunch of different spaces, industries. So I'm happy to be here today to talk about data analytics and really the bridge to automation, which I know is a space that you're especially focused. So thank you for having me.
No, of course, of course. We always love bringing thought leaders to the space, and I think your unique perspective, as kind of having studied the fundamentals of data and understanding sort of the strategy behind extracting data, it marries beautifully with what we try to do in automation, right? One of the tangential benefits of automating is that all of a sudden you're able to see things, right, that you can action on that
Mhm.
you weren't able to see before. It's very often that we find new use cases as a result of finding data that we didn't have structured before.
Yeah, there's a lot of positive energy around that thought. How to use automation to uh, create insights and strategies that will impact decision making and business outcomes. And I think to some degree, some of the fundamentals of data have become a little bit of a lost art. So hopefully we can talk about that and then eventually either here or another day get to sort of the more sexy data terms, if you will, automation, AI, machine learning, predictive analytics, prescriptive analytics. So, but you got to build the house, right? You got to before you get there. So, hopefully, we can do that a little bit today.
Absolutely. So in that spirit, we're going to focus on the foundational components, right? So we've decided to put together a series, right, of articles. And our first article is called The ABCs of Data. And so that's what I want to kind of focus on today. Let's talk about what it is that you're looking for when you're coming up with a data strategy. I think KPIs is probably something most folks can relate to. I think often, whether you're in sales or you're in finance, right? You have KPIs to measure against, and I think that's a good place to start. So why don't we talk a little bit about kind of the obvious versions of data extraction and data strategy, right? Some of the numbers that we look for in the measurements, and then we can get into kind of that, setting the table for what we're going to get into down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'll start by saying, to your point, the first step in the process is really identifying the overarching business outcome or strategy. This is what I would call the lagging indicator. So this is the thing that you're trying to influence at the end of the day. This might vary, it will certainly vary across industries, organizations. Being at Syracuse, again, working in the annual giving program, it might be very specifically the number of unrestricted donors or unrestricted revenue. So this is the thing at the end of the day that you're constantly striving for. And I think organizations, again, tend to build data teams without thinking about their lagging indicator first. And that's exactly what needs to be done. From there, you can focus a little bit on your leading indicators. And some of these you might not know right away. One of the challenges I've seen in organizations is that, everyone wants more and more data, more and more metrics. I recommend not doing that. I say pick 3, get really good at understanding those metrics, focus on being excellent relative to those metrics, and then maybe broaden the scope a little bit more. So I generally think that organizations, like I said, want to build data teams and then just want all this data. And then at the end of the day, none of it jives. So focus on first your lagging indicator, one single KPI, and then develop maybe 3 to 5 metrics. And these are levers, as I would call them, the things that will ultimately drive performance either positively or negatively in terms of your lagging indicators. So, I'll give you a very specific example.
That was what I was going to ask for next. You obviously know me well. Give us an example of something you're trying to measure for and, the components around it that you have to try to shoot for to be able to get that answer. So give us an example.
Of course. So, I worked at a rather popular nonprofit organization, which was all about providing experiences to children. And at the end of the day, our lagging indicator was the number of experiences that we would provide on an annual basis. So the things that I would call leading indicators, those levers that you need to adjust periodically to ensure that you reach your overall goal, might have been fundraising revenue, right? So certainly the revenue from donors that is brought into the business, the number of volunteers, and then you might have another sort of financial metric, bottom line related, or something operational, maybe even a human capital metric. So for us, being in the nonprofit space, obviously a lot of our revenue had to be attributed to staff, right? So we had a certain program ratio that we had to allocate dollars to ensure that we met the legalities of running the nonprofit. So those are very specific levers that you have to make sure that you're adjusting again to ultimately reach your overall goal of, in that case, providing experiences to children.
And I love that one. That's one of the greatest things because it's not always about a number that has to do with money necessarily, right? It depends on what your value system is, what it is that you're trying to solve for, and there is going to be a numerical component associated with it, but it's not always a dollar amount. So one of the things, and I'm going to digress here for a minute and you're off because that's what I do. But, it made me start thinking about the fact that context is very important when looking at these numbers as well. In sales, for example, it's often driven that your revenue number can then be associated all the way back to the number of emails you send per week, right? And that activity drives kind of this bigger funnel, and that gets you conversations that go. I have my theories about whether that's true or false. I think the quality of the conversations that you have matter more. So how, in that example that you just gave, could somebody that's trying to put a data strategy together compensate for that context? Often you have to answer these numbers to a CFO, a financial leader, right? They're not going to give more investment to what you're trying to achieve if you don't have a number. So when it comes to a lever that you're trying to pull that has to do with something outside of a financial bottom line, how do you add context to that story to make it relevant and viable and something that everybody's going to try to work towards making better?
Yeah, at the end of the day, I believe, there has to be some shared value, right? There has to be some shared interests. Your data team has to understand, and the executive leaders in the organization have to understand where it is you can make a difference. Now, some of that you will develop along the way. You might walk into a situation where you believe you have the right levers to pull, the right metrics identified, and then in 6 months, your business changes completely. And I think a lot of us have dealt with that over the course of the last year, right? How do we now adjust our operations to adhere to the times that we're in, and what metrics are relevant in the moment? But in terms of being able to contextualize some of that and communicate some of that, I think this is a huge challenge for data teams. There was a wonderful article recently, I believe the title of it is Data Science and the Art of Persuasion. Harvard Business Review released it, I believe, last week. And this article really talks about the challenge for data teams to be master manipulators of data, interpreters of data, strategists, and then also communicators of data. So the term that, as you know, is just floating out and about in the data world is unicorn, right? So we're constantly trying to find these unicorns, to help us not only understand the data, but then to inform our CFOs or our executive leaders of what that data is telling us so that they can make better business decisions. I think that's quite challenging, to be honest. And I think a lot of times, specific data teams might not actually be the appropriate personnel to convey that message. So it's up for debate, certainly. If you have a team, for instance, of maybe less than 5 people, and you work in an organization where you're supporting hundreds, I would suggest that, that's not the right team, right? So that's not the right personnel to be trying to convey that message. But that's something that we have to get better at. We have to get better at creating very specific goals and directions for data teams, instead of thinking that they're these all-encompassing environments that can just magically create leverage for us. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
No, it definitely does. And it's not just the person that can slice and dice an Excel spreadsheet that's supposed to be the data scientist, right? So it's both sides of it. You have to be able to understand, extract, and manipulate the data, but then contextualize it and be able to share that with teams outside of it. So my next question is going to be, when thinking of a data strategy within an organization, what's the type of talent you need on your team to be able to have a robust, and all-encompassing kind of answer some of those questions?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I think back to Deloitte. Deloitte has a talent analytics maturity model. And this maturity model really has about 4 components to it. I've used this for a while now in every organization I've been to help us understand, where you want your data team to be in whatever time frame you're setting, 3-5 years. But more importantly, where do you need them to be? So I think everyone, again, I mentioned that the world of data is sexy right now. So people want a team focused on analytics and strategy. But at the end of the day, they're not necessarily prepared for the predictive and prescriptive analytics that everyone thinks you can magically get to. So, first and foremost, if your team is largely retrievals-like, and I will say some of this is what we're struggling with right now at Syracuse, is how to transform the operation from an ad hoc reactive function to something that is more advanced, proactive, and providing that strategic insight that our executive leaders, for instance, convey. So I think you have to answer those 2 questions first. And if you, for instance, desire to focus on predictive or prescriptive analytics, you might bring in a tool like a Tableau or a TIBCO Spotfire, a data visualization function that really provides you with that quick analysis, that quick detail. But if that's the case, then you would need developers, perhaps, right, to develop that content, because those tools are quite robust and somewhat challenging to learn. But if you're largely reactive, then maybe you're getting away with using your classic Excel and pivot tables and eventually broadening that to some VBA or coding. So again, it really depends on what type of team you need in your operation.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And when we talk about operationalizing some of the reactive processes, right, in the world of RPA and automation, always what we're trying to do is take the opportunity to standardize as much as possible, realize efficiencies, so that what's left over is the stuff to analyze, right? It's trying to get to that place where you identify the outliers so that you can really start making decisions on why was that nuanced, right? Why was that weird? And so my next question actually it has to do with that. Outside, we've talked about KPIs. we've talked about the talent required. You know, what is the process, right, required to kind of modernize the organization to say data is what we're trying to look for, that is gold. How do we get there? How do we go from, you know, being reactive to the numbers, right? The big joke is, you know, the poor CFOs, they report on the historical data, and meanwhile their CEOs are going, what does 3 years from now look like, right? So how do you transform that? Is that a people thing? Is that a mentality shift? Is that a cultural shift? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, absolutely. First and foremost, it's largely cultural. Your organization has to believe in whatever vision you're setting for your data team. Again, I'll jump back to an HBR article that recently talked about how majority of data teams fail just because of the politics and the culture within the organization that they're working. Very few data teams actually fail because they don't have the skill sets or the technology, right? So I think a lot of times there's, you know, mission creep is a real problem for data teams. You know, you're focusing on one metric and then suddenly you're asked to do an analysis for another one. But I think something that you just mentioned, Paula, that is absolutely critical, and I'm happy it came up, and I know this is your process improvement days talking to me here. So you talked about standardization, right? You have to, before you even get to a point where you're extracting data, you have to talk about standardization relative to the CRMs that you're using, to the processes in which you're going to extract data and communicate that. I'll give you a very specific example. When I started at Syracuse University, there were some questions about how we pulled donors, right? So that's a process that we have to make sure that everyone understands so that we're on the same page, right? So the most sort of fundamental elements that you're responsible for in the data world in terms of metrics have to have some sort of standard operating procedure tied to them. I don't think people want to do that anymore. You know, it's so traditional, it's so old school. But the problem is now we send out data, we send out visualizations, and we have 1,000 little asterisks at the bottom, right, that say, please note, this is this time frame, this is this audience, this is this constituent, whatever it might be, instead of just saying, here's how we have arrived at X, right? So I'm a big believer in standard operating procedures and putting some standardization to every process, every data pull that you're responsible for. And then you can start exploring different ways to really interact with your system, your CRM, how to leverage it for efficiency, how to extract that information, or essentially have it extracted through some sort of API or data warehouse to auto feed, you know, various data visualization tools, whatever it might be. You know, that's really where you want to be, but you can't get there unless you have some of that standardization.
No, I agree wholeheartedly. And we say that all the time. You know, it used to be that before I even entered a conversation about automation with a prospective client or a rookie trying to understand it, the big no was, oh, we haven't standardized our processes. We haven't re-engineered everything yet. And so we have to do a re-engineering project first, right? Like we have an overhaul of our processes before we could get started. Now where we've gotten to is that we've used automation to force standardization. A lot of our solutions, especially the ones in the finance and accounting space, we've actually implemented to then show that the data begins to get structured as a result of it being repeated and done by a robot, right? Accurately, on time, all those beautiful benefits of having a machine do something that humans aren't really frankly designed to do, repetitive, manual tasks. So once we get past that, right, and we get past that phase, right? It was about 5 years ago, everybody wanted like Michael Hammer to come back and like process reengineering conversations. It was like, hold the phone, right? Like we've made technology smart enough to bypass all these exercises. But true or false, is it still at the end of the day about the people operating the technology more than it is whatever platform or CRM or data visualization tool that you choose?
Yeah, I believe that's true. I believe you need to develop a human capital strategy, right? And that maybe is part of that overarching strategy that we talked about. And when you're first defining what a data team looks like, you need to understand what kind of talent you have, what kind of talent you need, and what is that talent ultimately going to produce for you, right? Uh, the world of data is so specialized now, right? So there's very specific skill sets. For instance, if you want someone to focus on SQL Server, or again, we talked about some of the data visualization tools, or VBA, whatever it might be, R or Python, there are very specific resumes out there to address that. But you need to understand that and have a plan in place. I don't believe data teams do a great job of this. They talk about data. For instance, take a look at my title, Paula, data analytics and strategy. I can break down each one of those words into 3 separate buckets, which really encompass the end-to-end process of the data world, right? Data, the manipulation or extraction of data, analysis, really the insights that you're trying to derive from your data, and then strategy, the piece that you're trying to formulate that might impact your business outcomes. That's unbelievable, right? That might be someone's full-time position. You could have a full-time position focused merely on data extraction, right? So I do think that RPA eventually, now I'm from the world of higher ed right now, I know it's evolving, it'll play a huge role. I'm not so sure that it's going to eliminate the talent that we're talking about. I think it'll just transform the skills that we need in order to be successful.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think what it'll help us with, again, is just seeing what we have, and over the course of the last year, a lot of organizations have struggled with the idea of, oh, I have a plan. Well, your plan came to a screeching halt, right? When operating capital dried up, and all of a sudden layoffs are happening, and your human capital strategy was completely thrown out the window too. So what we learned is that there is kind of a balance between being reactive, and I think it's more ready, right? It's readiness rather than reactivity, and then also having a foundation of what your value system is going to be around the kind of data that you have. So one of the things that I actually just thought about, when you were talking about that, is not only have we talked about what we're looking to achieve in the future, right? As we're trying to, to lay that out. I think what COVID taught us too is that there is a certain sense of reactivity that comes into place that we have to be, mindful of. But it's not reactivity as much as kind of just readiness, right? And so if we kind of flip the script on the verbiage that we use, you got to be ready, right? For anything. We all learned that last year, but you also have to kind of have a plan in motion. And so one of the things that I've really been thinking about is all this data that's come out about mental health, right? And how important it is for us to focus on the interactivity between each other, right? This connectedness, the rising, Gen Z, right? There's a new one. We have millennials, we have, all these different converging generations in the workplace. And my theory, and my why around why I try to, automate and why I evangelize what I do, it's not just because it's my job. It's because I fully believe that the more data points you have about yourself, your partner, your organization, your business unit, your company, the better decision making that you can make, because you're doing it based on something that's tangible and real, right? And so for me, the importance behind data, I think, is more altruistic than we give it credit for. So the importance of cleansing it, scrubbing it, getting it prepared to be actionable, I think is absolutely, fundamental. I mean, that's literally why I do what I do. So that being said, I'm so excited about our project, right? We've kind of put together our thinking cap. We've got these ABCs getting started. What would you like for, everybody to kind of know about why it is that you do data? Why did you kind of take your process career, and you were in M&A, you went nonprofit, you've kind of done all these twists and turns, and you've landed on Dr. Data. So why is it that this matters so much to you? And what are you hoping to be able to transmit through your work and through these articles that we're putting together?
Yeah, great question. I don't know how much time we have, so I'll be concise here. But I think the data world, just how much it's evolved, certainly over my short career, really has done 3 excellent things and will continue to grow in these spaces. And one is to inform, right? So it really paints a picture for our constituents, our stakeholders. You talked about the pandemic. immediately when the pandemic hit, we started to see all these dashboards and the metrics. And, think about 50 years ago, right? Or maybe even 20 or 30, where none of that information is readily available to you. You talked about the difference between being reactive and really having something ready. I think that's exactly what we've learned. And I think data, again, number one, it has informed or has at least allowed us to make educated decisions, right? And that actually leads me to my next point. It's an educational piece at the end of the day. Whether you're looking at historical information, or again, I'll use the pandemic as an example. We started to see forecasts. We saw models of what the summer, winter, what the seasons might look like. And we were actively trying to predict, hospitalization rates, that's stuff that is completely unthought of 20 or 30 years ago, maybe. And then the last piece is I do think it provides equity. I think we're getting to a point where we're saying, and this is really the strategy piece, the analysis strategy piece that I talked about, it informs our stakeholders, creates some education opportunities. And then it's really a question of how do we use this information to create equity amongst all of our stakeholders? And that's something that I know you and I are really interested in and will continue to talk about. I don't think we're quite at the point where we're using data in that way, but I think the energy around that topic alone is growing rather significantly, and it's something that can't be ignored any further.
No, I agree wholeheartedly. And I'm looking forward to the rest of our journey. It's been very informative to kind of gather it. I feel like I'm in college all over again, thanks to your Syracuse influence. So I'm looking forward to kind of what we're going to produce. And hopefully this is a great start for some of the folks that we hope to bring along to the journey. So thanks so much for joining me, John.